The party was mostly over, down to the last stragglers finishing their drinks in the living room. I went down the hallway to grab more toilet paper for the guest bathroom, the kind of small hosting task that falls to you automatically when it's your apartment. The red dress was on the floor, the same dress Sasha had walked in wearing that night. Deep red, fitted. The one I'd noticed without really noticing when she'd arrived hours earlier. The bathroom door was cracked open, light spilling into the dim hallway. Sasha was standing inside, wearing Cora's clothes now. Gray sweatpants, an old hoodie that looked 2 sizes too big on her frame. She looked at me through the gap in the door, and for a second, neither of us said anything. "Don't touch it," she said, low enough that I wasn't sure I'd heard her right, low enough that I almost asked her to repeat herself. But her eyes I was sure about. Those weren't the eyes of someone making a joke, and they weren't the eyes of someone caught doing something embarrassing either. They were the eyes of someone doing quick, careful math on very little time. My name is Jake Merritt. I'm 29 years old, and I work as an associate photo editor at an independent arts magazine here in Nashville, Tennessee. The kind of job that rewards a careful eye and a fair amount of patience with people who think they know what a photograph needs better than the photographer does. I spend my days going back and forth between contributors and layout designers, negotiating crops and color grades, occasionally talking someone down from an artistic decision that would look great on their own website and terrible on a printed page. The kind of small diplomatic work that nobody outside the industry realizes is most of the actual job. I've lived in the same midtown apartment for 2 years now, 4th floor, big enough to feel like my own space, without feeling like I'm rattling around in it. Hardwood floors that catch good light in the evening, a bookshelf that runs the length of one wall, a standing lamp in the corner. I bought specifically because it made the room feel less like a place I was just passing through. I like routines. I like knowing where things are. I'm not the guy who throws parties, though I'd become, somehow, the guy whose apartment parties happened at, mostly because Cora liked the light in my living room and had strong opinions about hosting spaces that I'd learned not to argue with. Cora and I had been together 7 months at that point. She's a freelance fashion stylist, always traveling for one shoot or another, always pulling me into gatherings I wouldn't have organized myself, but usually ended up enjoying once I was actually there. We met at a mutual friend's gallery opening, hit it off over a shared dislike of the wine being served, and things moved at an easy, unremarkable pace from there. We fit together in a moderate kind of way. No huge sparks, but no real trouble either. Easy weekends and easy conversation. The kind of relationship that runs smoothly precisely because neither person is asking too much of it. I told myself that was what mature stability looked like. I'd had louder relationships before, ones that burned bright and then burned out, leaving behind the specific exhaustion that comes from too much intensity for too long. And I'd convinced myself that Cora and I represented the grown-up version of getting this right. Measured, comfortable, sustainable, in a way that felt, at the time, like wisdom rather than what it might have actually been, which was settling. I knew Sasha's name before I ever met her face. Cora talked about her constantly. My best friend. She knows all my worst stories, that kind of framing. The kind that makes a person feel present in your life before you've ever actually been in a room with them. Sasha Park, a commercial photographer, opinionated, not shy about saying what she actually thought, according to Cora's retelling. When I finally met her, at Cora's birthday dinner 4 months earlier at a small Italian place downtown, I noticed she was quieter than Cora's descriptions had suggested. But when she did talk, what she said tended to land exactly right, more precise than the conversation around it required, The kind of comment that made you realize she'd been listening more carefully than anyone else at the table, absorbing details other people had already forgotten they'd mentioned. Cora threw a small party at my place on a Saturday in early autumn. About 15 people, wine, low music playing from a speaker balanced on the bookshelf. The kind of gathering I usually approached with mild dread, and ended up not minding once it actually started. I'd spent the afternoon moving furniture around to make more open floor space, buying extra glasses because I never seemed to own enough, running a vacuum over floors that didn't strictly need it. The standard preparation rituals of hosting something you didn't originally plan to host but had agreed to without much resistance. That particular night, I found myself actually comfortable in the middle of it, more comfortable than I usually was at these things, and it took me a while to figure out why. It was the first time Sasha and I had ever really talked, just the two of us, not filtered through the crowd, not filtered through Cora standing between us the way she usually did without meaning to, simply by being the connective tissue that brought us both into the same rooms in the first place. Sasha arrived that night in a deep red cocktail dress, not attention-seeking, just fitted well. The kind of dress that suits someone without trying. The kind you notice for half a second, and then move past, because nothing about it demands a second look. Cora complimented it at the door, said something about the color being exactly right for the season, and Sasha thanked her the easy way. You thank someone for a compliment you've heard before. I didn't think much of it at the time, filed it away the way you file away any ordinary detail from an ordinary evening. I only remembered it later, in far more detail than the moment itself had warranted, because she didn't leave in it. I knew Sasha's name from about the second month I was dating Cora, I remember thinking, more than once during those early months. Knew it the way you know a name repeated so many times it becomes familiar before the face ever attaches itself to it. A person who exists in your mind entirely through someone else's description before you ever meet them yourself. Then I actually met her, and I realized Cora talked about Sasha the way people talk about someone they understand more than they consciously realize they do. To understand what actually happened that night in my bathroom, you need the rest of the party first. The small things that only made sense to me much later, once I understood what Sasha had actually been navigating the whole time she was standing in my kitchen laughing at something I said, carrying a version of the evening that had almost nothing to do with the version I was experiencing beside her. Most of the party, Sasha and I found ourselves in the kitchen, not on purpose, just both of us drifting away from the loudest part of the crowd at the same time, the way two people who aren't natural extroverts tend to migrate toward the quieter corner of any gathering. We talked about work. Photography and photo editing had enough overlap that the conversation ran naturally. No forced small talk, just two people who understood the same industry from slightly different angles. She told me about a shoot that had gone sideways the week before because a client insisted on lighting choices that flattened everything into a shadowless mess, and I told her about a photographer who'd once sent me raw files with no color correction whatsoever and expected me to simply intuit his vision from a stack of murky, underexposed images, insisting over email that any editor worth their salary would just feel what he was going for. We laughed about the specific kind of frustration that comes from working in a field where everyone thinks they have an eye for it, where clients with strong opinions and no formal training regularly override people who actually know what they're talking about. And somehow the work still turns out fine more often than it has any right to. A small miracle neither of us could fully explain, but both appreciated. At one point, Cora drifted by with a tray of something, asked what we were laughing about, and neither of us managed a very good answer. It wasn't really about anything specific, just the accumulation of a conversation that had built its own momentum. I noticed she asked questions like someone who genuinely wanted the answer, not someone waiting for her turn to talk. Circling back to something I'd said 10 minutes earlier because she'd actually retained it. A small habit that struck me as rarer than it should be. The ability to actually listen rather than just wait politely for a gap to fill with your own next sentence. Around 10 o'clock, I saw her glance at her phone, her expression shifting for just a second before she set it face down and turned back to the conversation, smiling again like nothing had happened. It was a small thing, barely a flicker, the kind of moment you'd only notice if you happened to be looking directly at someone's face at the exact right instant. I remember thinking, in the vaguest possible way, that it looked like the expression people get when they see a name they weren't hoping to see. A specific tightening around the eyes that most people learn to hide quickly once they realize someone's watching. I didn't ask about it. I had no reason to think it was anything more than an annoying work email or a friend asking where she was, and the conversation moved on quickly enough that I didn't hold on to the thought. Around 11, the group started thinning out, people gathering coats and calling for ride shares, the particular choreography of a party winding down, the volume of conversation dropping in stages as smaller groups peeled off toward the door. Sasha stayed behind, telling Cora she wanted to help clean up. I didn't think anything of it. Cora seemed pleased, said something about how Sasha was always the one who actually helped instead of just offering and then disappearing the moment there were dishes involved. I went down the hallway toward the bathroom to grab more toilet paper for the guest half bath, saw the light on through the cracked door, and looked in. The red dress was on the bathroom floor, folded in on itself the way clothes fall when they're removed carefully rather than thrown, not the careless heap of someone who'd simply gotten too warm and shed a layer. Sasha was standing there in a pair of Cora's sweatpants and an old university hoodie I recognized from Cora's closet, both of them slightly too big on her frame. She looked at me through the gap in the door. Her expression wasn't embarrassed exactly. It was focused, the way someone looks when they're in the middle of solving a problem and don't have the bandwidth left over for social niceties. She didn't explain anything. "Don't touch it," she said. Then, quieter, glancing past me down the hallway like she was checking for anyone else. "Can you give me a minute? And don't say anything to Cora yet." I stood in the hallway, my back against the wall, listening to the muffled sounds of the party still going on in the living room. I didn't ask what was happening. I just waited. The way you wait when some instinct tells you the questions can come later. 5 minutes later, Sasha came through the hallway with her bag over her shoulder, hair pulled back differently than when she'd arrived, wearing Cora's clothes instead of her own dress, moving with a kind of controlled quickness that wasn't quite rushing, but wasn't casual either, the pace of someone who'd decided exactly how fast to walk in order to look unremarkable while still covering ground efficiently. She looked at me for a second, something passing behind her eyes that I couldn't fully name at the time. "Thank you," she said. Just those 2 words, nothing more. Then she left, out the front door and into the hallway of the building, without saying goodbye to Cora, without saying goodbye to anyone else still lingering in the living room, moving with the specific purpose of someone who had somewhere important to be and no time to spare on social formalities, her footsteps quick and even on the hallway carpet until the elevator doors closed behind her. The red dress stayed on my bathroom floor, a small, deliberate absence in the room she'd just left. I picked it up and hung it on the hook behind the door, smoothing it out without really thinking about why I bothered. Some instinct telling me the dress deserved to be treated carefully, even though I had no idea what it actually represented. I didn't say anything to Cora, who was in the kitchen loading glasses into the dishwasher, humming along to whatever was still playing from the speaker, entirely unaware that anything unusual had just happened 20 feet away. I didn't know why Sasha had told me not to touch it, but the way she'd said it made me not want to ask, made me feel like asking would somehow be a violation of something I didn't fully understand yet. A private emergency I'd been allowed to witness the edge of, but not the center. That night, lying in bed long after everyone had left, the apartment finally quiet again, Cora already asleep beside me, I kept thinking about her eyes in that doorway. Not in a romantic way, not at that point, though I'd wonder later whether some part of the attraction had already been quietly forming even then. More like, someone had looked at me the way you look at a person when you're checking whether they can be trusted, running a quick, silent calculation under real pressure, and deciding, apparently, in the space of about 2 seconds, that the answer was yes. I fell asleep, still turning that over, still not entirely sure what I'd just been part of. For 2 weeks after that, I kept the dress in my closet. Didn't ask Cora about it. Didn't bring it up. It hung there among my own shirts, an odd splash of red among the muted colors I usually wore, and I found myself glancing at it more often than made any sense for a piece of clothing that had nothing to do with me. Cora never mentioned it either. Either she genuinely didn't know, or she was giving Sasha the same kind of space I'd instinctively given her that night. I told myself Sasha had her reasons, but I kept thinking about the way she'd said those 3 words, the particular flatness in her voice that suggested she wasn't asking so much as instructing. The way you instruct someone when the stakes are higher than the words themselves let on. One afternoon, coming home from work a little later than usual, tired and thinking mostly about dinner, I found a man standing in the hallway outside my apartment door, positioned like he'd been waiting there a while and had no intention of looking impatient about it. 33, maybe a couple years older, dressed sharp in a way that didn't look like effort, the kind of expensive casual that takes money and time to achieve without appearing to try. He had the kind of presence that filled a hallway without needing to raise his voice, the sort of stillness some men cultivate specifically because it unsettles people more effectively than aggression would. "You're Jake? I'm Dean. Sasha's ex." He said it evenly, almost pleasantly, extending a hand I didn't take, his smile settling into something practiced when I declined it, like he'd anticipated the possibility and had a plan ready either way. He wore the kind of watch that costs more than most people's monthly rent, positioned casually enough that I understood I was meant to notice it without him having to point it out. He wasn't aggressive, not in any way I could have pointed to directly or described convincingly to someone else afterward. He talked like someone here to clear up a simple misunderstanding between reasonable adults, his tone pitched perfectly to sound like patience rather than persistence. "I just wanted to grab a few things of Sasha's. She left something here. A red dress, I think? I know it sounds strange, but she does this." "There's nothing of hers here," I said, which was, in the most literal sense, a lie, and I was surprised by how easily it came out, how little hesitation I felt lying to a man I'd just met. As though some part of me had already decided which side of this I was on before I'd consciously worked out the reasoning. "Jake, she has some issues. I'm not saying this to hurt her. I'm saying it because I'm concerned about her. She does this thing where she leaves items at people's places and then uses it later to build a story, to make herself look like she's in danger from something that isn't really there. I dealt with this for over a year. I know the pattern better than anyone. It's not her fault exactly. I think something happened to her a long time ago that made her think this way, and I tried to help, but eventually it became too much for one relationship to hold." He said it with the kind of practiced concern that sounded, on its surface, like genuine worry, the voice of someone who'd rehearsed this exact conversation more than once, refining it until it hit the right note of reluctant honesty. The kind of delivery that only comes from having used the same lines successfully on other people before. Then came the line that landed hardest, delivered almost gently, in the tone of a man doing someone a favor. "Did she tell you anything? About me? I think you should know she has a history of making things up to get people to protect her. I'm not trying to turn you against her. I just don't want you to get pulled into something you don't understand." I didn't hand over the dress. I didn't say anything else, just stood there in my own doorway, feeling the specific discomfort of not knowing which parts of what I was hearing were manipulation and which parts might, uncomfortably, be true, the way a well-constructed lie always borrows a little credibility from whatever true things surround it. Dean left after another moment, polite the whole time, thanking me for my time like he'd just stopped by to say hello to a new neighbor. Nothing more, offering a small nod on his way to the elevator that somehow felt more unsettling than if he'd raised his voice. I stood in the hallway afterward for a long time, longer than I meant to, listening to the elevator doors open and close somewhere down the corridor as other tenants came and went, none of them aware of the conversation still ringing in my head, thinking about Sasha's eyes that night in the bathroom doorway. Two versions of the story were competing in my head, refusing to resolve into anything clean. Dean's right, and Sasha has a problem. And I'm the naive stranger being drawn into someone else's instability by a woman skilled at making people feel useful to her. Or Dean is exactly the reason Sasha had to change clothes in the first place. And everything he'd just told me was a carefully constructed frame designed to make his own behavior look like concern rather than control. The kind of story a man tells when he needs witnesses on his side before anyone starts asking harder questions about him. I called Cora that evening, later than I usually did. Asked about Sasha in a way I tried hard to make sound casual, tossed in between other conversations so it wouldn't stand out or draw attention to why I was actually asking. Cora said Sasha was fine, going through a rough patch. Nothing more specific than that. I asked why, keeping my tone light. Cora went quiet for a second on the other end of the line, longer than the question probably warranted, long enough that I could picture her deciding how much to actually say. "Dean's not someone who lets go easily," she finally said, her voice dropping slightly, and there was something careful in how she said it, like she was choosing to give me only the smallest fraction of what she actually knew. That didn't tell me much on its own, but it told me enough to know Cora already knew part of it too, and that whatever part she knew, she wasn't yet ready to share the rest of, that some line of loyalty was keeping her from saying more than she already had. Dean wasn't entirely wrong. That was the part that kept me standing in that hallway long after he'd gone. The most dangerous lie isn't the one that's completely false. It's the one that's half true. Told by someone who understands exactly how much doubt the other half will create. I asked Cora to ask Sasha if she wanted her things back. I framed it as casually as I could, like I was just doing basic apartment housekeeping, returning something borrowed. Nothing more significant than that. Cora relayed the question over text without asking why I hadn't just returned it myself weeks earlier, which I was grateful for. Sasha texted back within the hour, faster than I expected. "I'll come by." No further explanation, no proposed time, nothing that suggested she needed to think it over. She showed up alone, 2 days later, no set time, just a knock on my door on a Tuesday afternoon. While I was working from home, my laptop open on the kitchen table with an editing job half finished that I abandoned the moment I heard the knock. I opened the door, and she stood there for a second on the threshold before stepping inside, looking at me the way she'd looked at me through the bathroom door that night, like she was reading which direction the situation had gone, whether I was someone she could still trust with the rest of the story, or someone she'd need to manage carefully. "Dean came to see me," I said, deciding there was no point easing into it. She stopped mid-step in the middle of my living room, the closed laptop on my table forgotten between us. Her face didn't change much, the same composed expression she'd worn most of the night we met, but her shoulders dropped in a way she clearly hadn't intended, a small physical admission that betrayed more than her expression did. She didn't deny anything, didn't apologize for leaving the dress, didn't act embarrassed about any of it. None of the sheepishness I might have expected from someone caught in an unusual situation. She just told me straight, sitting down on my couch like she'd decided this conversation deserved to happen properly, rather than standing in a doorway, the same deliberateness I'd noticed in her that first time we talked in my kitchen. I knew he was outside that night. He'd been following me for 2 weeks by that point, parked across the street from my building, showing up at places he had no reason to be, sending texts that were technically nothing, technically just checking in, but arriving with a frequency that made clear he wasn't actually letting go. That night, he saw me walk into your building wearing the red dress. I noticed his car when I got out of the cab, that specific dark blue he drives, and I knew immediately he'd followed me from my apartment. If I walked out in that same dress, he'd recognize me immediately from half a block away and could follow me from there, and I didn't know where I'd go next if he did. I changed into Cora's clothes because I needed to look like a completely different person leaving that building, someone he wouldn't recognize even glancing quickly from a parked car. She paused, glancing toward my closet where the dress had been hanging for 2 weeks, as though she could see straight through the door to where it hung among my ordinary shirts. The dress. I couldn't bring it with me. He was watching the entrance. My bag wasn't big enough to hide it without the shape being obvious, without him noticing something was off. I said, "Don't touch it," because I needed it to still be there if he somehow got up to your floor and looked through a window or asked around. I needed there to be evidence I hadn't left yet, in case he came looking that same night. I listened to all of it without interrupting, letting each piece settle before the next one arrived, understanding for the first time the actual shape of what she'd been carrying alone for weeks, while the rest of us had simply gone about our ordinary evenings. Then I finally said the thing I'd been circling since she walked in. "You used me as cover." "Yes," she said, meeting my eyes without flinching from the accusation. "And I'm sorry for that. I know it wasn't fair to put you in that position without any explanation. To walk into your bathroom during your own party and rearrange the whole evening around a crisis you didn't know existed. But I didn't have another option in that exact moment, and you were the person standing closest to a working solution. Why didn't you just tell Cora?" I asked, since Cora was, after all, her best friend. "Because Cora doesn't stay calm well. She loves me, and she would have made a scene. Called the police right there at the party, probably confronted him herself if she'd seen him outside. And any of that would have escalated things faster than I could manage. And I needed someone who could just quietly get me out without turning it into an event. Someone who could hold a single piece of information without needing to act on it immediately." "You thought I was calm?" I asked, genuinely curious how she'd arrived at that conclusion about a man she'd exchanged maybe 40 minutes of conversation with. She looked at me directly, something almost amused in her expression, despite the seriousness of what she was describing. "I watched you the whole night before that happened. The way you talked, the way you listened to people without needing to fill every silence, the way you let Cora tell the same story twice without pointing it out. I knew you were the kind of person who could handle something like that without panicking or asking 12 questions I didn't have time to answer. Some people you can just tell. It's not scientific. I just knew." I got the dress from the closet and handed it to her, the fabric slightly cool from sitting untouched for 2 weeks, catching a bit of the afternoon light through my living room window as it moved between us, the red suddenly vivid in a room otherwise full of muted, ordinary colors. She held it, turned it over once in her hands, looked at it the way you look at an object that used to mean something purely practical and now means something else entirely, something layered with everything that had happened around it. Weeks of fear and careful planning folded into a piece of fabric that had once just been something she wore to a party. "You kept it this whole time? You said don't touch it, not don't keep it." She laughed at that. A real laugh, unguarded, surprised out of her almost. The first time I'd seen her laugh like she genuinely meant it, rather than the polite version she'd been offering at the party. It changed her whole face for a second, softened something in her expression that had been held carefully in place since she'd walked through my door that afternoon, and I found myself hoping I'd get to see it again, hoping this wasn't going to be the last time she sat on my couch and told me something true. I had a friend from law school, a guy named Marcus, who'd gone into family law and handled protective orders regularly, someone I hadn't talked to in months but still had saved in my contacts from a mutual friend's wedding 2 years back, one of those connections that stays dormant until the exact moment it turns out to matter. I connected Sasha with him, not out of some hero complex, not trying to insert myself into her situation more than I already had, just because I knew someone, and knew that kind of connection mattered when you were dealing with a person like Dean. Sasha and Marcus met the following week, a Thursday afternoon in his downtown office, and by her account, he was direct and unsentimental about it in exactly the way she needed someone to be at that point, walking her through the paperwork without softening any of the practical details she needed to hear clearly. Dean got a formal warning filed against him through the proper legal channels, the kind of paper trail that starts to matter if things escalate further. The first documented mark against a man who up until then had operated entirely on plausible deniability and other people's reluctance to make a fuss, on the assumption that nobody would bother going through the trouble of putting anything in writing. He tried reaching out one more time anyway, about 3 weeks later, this time through Cora, rather than coming to my building directly, asking her to pass along a message about wanting to talk things through like adults, framing himself, as always, as the reasonable party in all of this. Cora mentioned it to me casually, without realizing what she was actually mentioning, tossing it into a conversation about something else entirely, some unrelated update about a mutual acquaintance's engagement, the message about Dean buried in the middle like an afterthought. I told Sasha gently, calling rather than texting because some things deserve a voice attached to them, not wanting to alarm her, but feeling like she needed to know regardless. She handled it directly with her lawyer this time. No need for me to get further involved beyond that first phone call. And Dean didn't try again after that, not through Cora, not through anyone else in our shared circle of acquaintances. Whatever calculation he was running behind that composed exterior, the involvement of an actual attorney seemed to shift the numbers for him in a way that neither Sasha's fear nor my quiet refusal at the door had managed to. A month after the party, Cora and I had a real conversation about where things stood between us, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with coffee going cold between us, with the kind of honesty that only shows up once you've both quietly arrived at the same conclusion, separately, and are simply waiting for the other person to say it first. Nobody had lied. Nothing had blown up. We'd just realized, independently and then together, that the moderate stability we'd built wasn't enough to keep building on, that 7 months in we should have felt more urgency about each other than either of us actually did. We ended things without any real conflict, no raised voices, no accusations, just 2 people finally naming out loud what had been quietly true for a while, sitting with it together instead of pretending otherwise. Cora moved on within a few months, started seeing someone from one of her shoots, a lighting technician she'd mentioned once or twice, without me thinking much of it. I was fine, genuinely fine, in the specific way you're fine when an ending arrives at exactly the moment it was always going to arrive, no earlier and no later, timed by something neither of us could have accelerated even if we'd tried. 2 months after that, I didn't reach out to Sasha. Not because I wasn't thinking about her. I thought about her more than I wanted to admit. The way she'd looked at me in that bathroom doorway, the sound of her laugh in my living room, the particular directness she had in conversation that I hadn't encountered in a long time. But I didn't want to be the guy who showed up right after a breakup looking like he'd been waiting for the opening the whole time, timing his interest to the exact moment it became convenient and calling it coincidence. I knew how that would look from the outside, and it wasn't an accurate reflection of how I actually felt about any of it. I wasn't interested in her because Cora was gone. I'd been interested for longer than that, quietly and without acting on it, and I wanted to give it enough space and enough time to prove that to myself before I ever tried proving it to her. Sasha texted me first, near the end of that 2-month stretch, a photo of an old coffee shop in Nashville, no caption attached, just the image itself. Morning light coming through a window I recognized from somewhere in the back of my memory, a place I'd mentioned once in passing months earlier during that first real conversation in my kitchen. I sat with that photo for 15 minutes, staring at it longer than any ordinary text message deserved, turning my phone over once and picking it back up before finally texting back. "I know that place." She replied, "I know you do." It took her all of 4 minutes to respond, which told me she'd been sitting with her own phone in hand, waiting to see what I'd say, the same way I'd been waiting for hers. It's early spring now, 6 months after that party. The Nashville air finally starting to lose its winter edge. Sasha and I are sitting at that same coffee shop she sent me a photo of, a small, unassuming place on a corner near her apartment, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu that changed too often for anyone to memorize. Not a date with a name attached to it, not something either of us had explicitly proposed as one. Just coffee, and 2 people who don't need a reason anymore to sit across from each other, who've settled into the kind of ease that used to take other relationships years to reach, and somehow arrived here without either of us forcing it. We'd been seeing each other, slowly and without fanfare, for about 6 weeks by that point. A few dinners, a couple of long walks along the Cumberland River, one evening spent at a gallery opening she was covering for a client, one memorably terrible attempt at cooking together that ended with both of us ordering takeout instead. The accumulation of ordinary time together that neither of us had rushed toward, and that felt, precisely because of that unhurried pace, more solid than anything either of us had built in a while. The red dress is still in my closet. Nobody ever came to take it. Not Sasha in all the months since, not anyone else. "You still have that dress?" she asks, stirring her coffee slowly, not quite looking at me directly yet. "You didn't take it that day," I remind her, though she clearly already remembers. "I don't want to wear it anymore." "Why not?" I ask, genuinely curious now, waiting for whatever she says next. She sets the spoon down, finally looks up, meeting my eyes across the small table between us. "Because I don't need to hide anymore." She says it simply, without any weight of drama attached, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. And somehow, that plainness makes it land harder than if she'd said it with more emphasis. Outside the window, someone's dog barks twice at a passing cyclist, and the ordinary noise of the street continues completely unaware of what just got said between us. I think about that phrase, "Don't touch it," more than you'd expect, turning it over in odd, quiet moments, in the shower, driving home from work. At the time, I thought she was talking about the dress, a simple instruction about a simple object. Later, I understood she was talking to herself as much as to me. Don't get touched. Don't get exposed. Don't let yourself be seen while you're afraid, because being seen in that state felt like handing someone a piece of leverage she couldn't afford to give away, not even to a relative stranger standing in a hallway. Dean was right about one thing, and I've had to sit with that honestly rather than pretend otherwise. I didn't know Sasha. Not really. Not at that point. We'd had one real conversation over the course of a few hours at a party. But he was wrong to think that not knowing someone completely meant you couldn't trust them in a specific, narrow moment. I didn't need the whole story to decide someone deserved 5 minutes of privacy in a bathroom with the door cracked and fear written plainly across her face. Some decisions don't require complete information. They just require paying attention to the one piece of information that actually matters, and knowing enough to trust it when it arrives. Sasha didn't need me to save her, and I think it's worth saying that plainly. She'd already saved herself, already worked out the entire plan, the outfit swap, the timing, the exact reasoning for why she needed to stay behind while everyone else filtered out, before I ever walked down that hallway looking for toilet paper on an ordinary errand that happened to intersect with something far more consequential. She needed me not to wreck the plan she'd already built herself, to step back, ask nothing, and let her execute the exit she'd already designed. Those are two very different things, and I think that difference is the whole reason any of this worked out the way it did. The reason she trusted me enough to text me a photo of a coffee shop 6 months later, instead of just letting the whole thing quietly fade. So let me ask you something. Have you ever done something for someone without knowing the full reason, just because something in their voice told you it was the right thing to do, before you had time to think through the logic of it, before you'd even decided consciously that you were going to say yes? And if someone told you don't touch it, standing in a doorway with fear plain on their face and their voice barely steady, would you have trusted them enough not to ask why? At least not right away. I think about how close I came to asking anyway, that night in the hallway, how the question sat right there on my tongue for almost a full minute before I decided to let it go. How easy it would have been to push the door open a little further, demand an explanation before I gave anyone 5 minutes of privacy. I'm glad I didn't. I think about what those 5 minutes actually cost her to ask for, the vulnerability of it, the risk of being refused by a near stranger, and what it would have cost her if I'd said no. If this story reminds you of someone you trusted without needing the whole explanation, or someone who trusted you that way once, leave a comment and tell me about it. Like this video if you believe that trusting the right person matters more than understanding everything up front. And subscribe for next week's story about ordinary people and the small decisions nobody expected to matter this much.